One wrong text, one dangerous man, and suddenly the line between safety and surrender blurs beyond recognition. Sara Robertson's worst day was about to become her most consequential night, all because she couldn't read a contact name before hitting send. The cursor blinked accusingly at Sara Robertson's screen, mocking her like everything else in her life lately seemed to do. She stared at the invoice she'd sent 3 weeks ago, the one for the logo redesign that should have paid her rent and groceries for the next month. Unpaid, ignored, like the 7 messages she'd sent before this one. Her studio apartment was silent except for the ambient hum of the refrigerator, that constant white noise that had become the soundtrack to her struggle. The space was barely large enough to call an apartment. 800 square feet crammed with a futon that served as both bed and couch, a desk drowning in design samples and sketches, and shelves lined with awards she'd won in better times. A cruel reminder that she'd once been someone clients actually wanted to hire. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the familiar burn of too many late nights and too much screen time. The dark circles beneath them had become permanent fixtures, badges of honor in the battle to keep her head above water. Outside her single window, the evening stretched gray and indifferent. October had turned the city cold, and her apartment's heating system seemed to operate on a philosophical disagreement with the concept of warmth. The unpaid invoice sat there like an accusation. Sara reached for her phone, a 3-year-old model with a cracked corner and a battery that died if she let the screen below 30%. Her contact list glowed with names of people who might actually listen to her frustration. She found Marcus, her best friend since college, now an accountant at some downtown firm who actually kept regular employment. Exactly who she meant to text. Except her fingers, moving with the muscle memory of exhaustion, found a different contact. A number she'd apparently saved months ago and never contacted. The name at the top was just 3 letters, unfamiliar the moment she noticed it. Don. She didn't pause to wonder who Don was. Her thumbs were already moving, already composing the message that would change everything. This is insane. Client won't pay. Says the work isn't what we discussed. It's exactly what we discussed. I have emails, proof. How is this my life right now? She hit send before the self-doubt could catch her. The message disappeared into the void. That digital limbo where wrong number texts go to haunt people with embarrassing admissions. Sara grimaced. She'd done this before, texted the wrong person, something she'd meant for someone else. Usually it was harmless. An awkward apology, a laugh about the mix-up, everyone moved on. But her thumbs were already moving again, already adding more fuel to the fire. That's what frustration did. It made you reckless. Made you say things you wouldn't normally articulate into the endless digital void. And before you ask, no, I don't have backup clients or savings or any safety net whatsoever. Just me and my laptop and apparently the worst luck in the design industry. She sent that too. Then, because the words kept flowing and she was too tired to filter them, one more message. I'm at Westside Coffee every Tuesday. That's where I overheard those people talking about territory expansion, about the Alpha's territory being encroached on. I didn't think it was real business talk until I got home and realized they weren't joking. But what do I know? I can't even keep my own clients happy. The moment she hit send, her brain caught up to her fingers. Alpha's territory. Why had she written that? What had she actually overheard at the coffee shop? Sara scrolled back through her memory, trying to piece together the conversation she'd half listened to while waiting for her macchiato last Tuesday. 2 men in dark coats, speaking in low, intense voices. Something about territorial claims, and the Alpha won't tolerate, and Westbrook area is already claimed. She'd assumed it was some kind of business jargon or maybe a reference to a video game. People talked about fantasy stuff at coffee shops all the time, but phrasing it out loud, in text to a stranger, made it sound sinister, deliberate, like she'd uncovered something she wasn't supposed to know. Her phone buzzed. Sara jumped, her heart performing an uncomfortable gymnastics routine in her chest. Wrong numbers didn't usually respond. This one did. 3 words delivered with the kind of precision that made her stomach clench. Who is this? She typed quickly, already embarrassed and reaching for damage control. Sorry, wrong person. Please ignore or need my mistake. The response came almost immediately, faster than any normal person would type, like whoever was on the other end had been waiting. What Castelli job? Sarah's hands went cold. She hadn't mentioned any job. She hadn't mentioned anyone named Castelli. She'd mentioned the Alpha, which she'd assumed was some kind of nickname or code in whatever business those men were conducting, or maybe just her sleep-deprived brain making connections that didn't exist. But this Don person was asking about a Castelli job like they knew exactly what she was talking about, like they understood the context of something she'd barely understood herself. I don't know any Castelli. I think you have the wrong number. I'm sorry for the confusion. She waited for the response, her fingers hovering over the phone like it might bite. But you know about the Alpha's territory, about pack business. How? Pack business. That word, pack, sat on her screen like a warning flag she didn't know how to interpret. Packs were animals, wolves, or sports teams. Nothing that should be part of a business conversation at a coffee shop unless these people were speaking in code, or she'd misheard, or this was some kind of elaborate prank. I really don't know what you're talking about. I just overheard something at a coffee shop. It was nothing. I'm sorry I bothered you. Her finger hovered over the delete contact button. Whatever this was, it was making her deeply uncomfortable. She should block the number. Forget this conversation ever happened. Instead, her phone buzzed again. Your address, now. It wasn't a question, just a demand, delivered with the kind of authority that made her feel like she had no actual option to refuse, despite the fact that this was clearly insane. She was about to refuse, to tell this stranger they were out of their mind, when another message came through. But before she could read it, her apartment went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when the world suddenly stops moving. When the normal sounds of the city, traffic, voices, the constant ambient noise of urban life, just cease. Sarah got up and moved to her window, unsure what she was looking for, but driven by an instinct that screamed something was wrong. That's when she saw them. Black SUVs. 3 of them, sleek and pristine despite the October evening. They pulled up to her building with coordinated precision, parking in spots that hadn't been occupied seconds before. The engines ran, but the lights stayed off. Headlights dark, exhaust steaming in the cold air. Her phone buzzed again. We have a situation. We need to talk about what you know. Don't be alarmed. We're here to help. Don't be alarmed. As if armed men in expensive vehicles surrounding your apartment building was somehow a normal Tuesday evening that required only minimal concern. As if the casual, matter-of-fact tone could offset the fact that her apartment suddenly felt like the last refuge before stepping into something far more dangerous than financial desperation or an unpaid invoice. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She should call the police. She should what? Report that 3 SUVs had parked outside her building? That a stranger was texting her mysterious messages? None of it sounded real, not even to herself. Heavy footsteps echoed in the stairwell, the kind of deliberate, unhurried steps that suggested whoever was climbing toward her apartment had no doubt about their right to be there. Sarah glanced at her door, at the simple deadbolt that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate, at the chain lock she'd never actually used. Her phone lit up one more time. Open the door, Sarah. It's time you understood what world you just stepped into. She never remembered giving this stranger her name. That realization that he knew who she was, where she lived, what she'd overheard, and apparently what she needed to understand about some hidden world, sent ice through her veins. One wrong text. One careless message about things she didn't understand to someone who clearly understood everything. The knock came soft, controlled, almost polite. And Sara Robertson, standing in her tiny apartment, staring at a door that suddenly felt like the barrier between her ordinary life and something extraordinary and terrible, realized that the worst part about making a mistake wasn't the immediate consequences. It was realizing there was no way to take it back. That realization, that he knew who she was, where she lived, what she'd overheard, and apparently what she needed to understand about some hidden world, sent ice through her veins. One wrong text, One careless message about things she didn't understand as someone who clearly understood everything. The knock came soft, controlled, almost polite. And Sara Robertson, standing in her tiny apartment staring at a door that suddenly felt like the barrier between her ordinary life and something extraordinary and terrible, realized that the worst part about making a mistake wasn't the immediate consequences. It was realizing there was no way to take it back. But to understand how a struggling graphic designer could stumble into the closely guarded world of supernatural packs and powerful alphas, you have to first understand Sara Robertson herself, not the terrified woman about to open that door, but the ordinary person she'd been just hours earlier. Welcome back, dear family and friends. Get comfortable and let's drift into today's story together. Don't forget to subscribe and share where you're joining from in the comments. A brand new story awaits you tomorrow, so stay tuned, subscribe, and claim your special bonus from the pinned comment. Sarah's hand trembled on the deadbolt. She could still change her mind, could not open the door, could call 911 and report. What exactly? That a stranger had texted her and now armed men surrounded her building? They'd think she was paranoid. They might think she was delusional. Which, given that she was about to open her door to face someone who'd mentioned werewolves in pack territories like they were discussing the weather, might actually be accurate. She turned the lock. The man standing in her doorway seemed to fill the entire frame, not because he was abnormally tall, though he was tall, but because of the way he occupied space. Like the air itself bent around him, made room for him, understood his supremacy without argument. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and beneath it, a black shirt left open at the collar. A thin silver chain caught the hallway light, drawing attention to the strong line of his jaw, the dark stubble that suggested controlled negligence rather than actual carelessness. When his eyes met hers, Sarah forgot how to breathe. They were impossibly blue. Not the soft blue of summer skies, but something harder, sharper. Predator blue, the kind of eyes that saw through pretense and found the truth lurking beneath. She watched them catalog her appearance. The yoga pants she'd thrown on 3 days ago, the oversized sweater with a coffee stain near the hem, her hair pulled into a messy bun that had probably escaped in approximately 40 directions. His gaze lingered for a fraction too long on her face before returning to her eyes. "Sara Robertson," he said, and his voice was exactly what she would have imagined for a man who looked like he did. Low, controlled, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I'm Don Brown. I apologize for the dramatic arrival, but we needed to ensure you wouldn't do anything foolish before we talked." Foolish. Like she might run, like she had anywhere to run from this. "Who?" Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat. "Who are you? Why are there armed men outside my apartment?" "May I come in?" Don asked, and it was phrased as a question but delivered as a foregone conclusion. He was already moving past her, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. Filling her tiny living room with his presence the way a predator fills a space with the fact of its existence. Sarah closed the door behind him, a reflexive action that immediately felt like a mistake. She'd just locked herself in a room with a stranger. But the alternative was leaving it open, admitting someone might be watching, might be waiting. At least here, in her apartment, there were walls between her and the black SUVs. Walls that suddenly felt very thin. Don moved through her space with the casual authority of someone used to taking up residence wherever he pleased. He didn't sit, didn't make himself comfortable. He simply stood, absorbing everything. The framed prints from art school, the mismatched furniture, the half-eaten sandwich on her desk beside the glowing laptop. His expression remained unreadable. But something flickered in those blue eyes. Assessment. Calculation. "You overheard a conversation last Tuesday at Westside Coffee," he said without preamble. "Two men speaking about territorial boundaries and pack movements. You mentioned it offhandedly in a text you thought was going to your friend Marcus, but which actually reached me." "I don't—" Sarah's mouth was dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." Don turned to face her fully. "The conversation you partially overheard included information about the Blackstone Pack's plans to encroach on territory that belongs to my pack, the Northern Dominion. That conversation was meant to be private. Classified, if you will. And you, inadvertently became a security liability. Pack, Sara repeated numbly. You keep using that word like it means something specific. It does. Don moved to her window, peering through the blinds at the street below where his men waited. My pack is a community of people, extended families really, bound by blood, loyalty, and nature. We live under an established hierarchy with territorial agreements that have existed for over a century. Breaking those agreements causes wars. Wars that don't just affect us. He turned back to her. Wars that affect people like you. Innocent humans who stumble into the fringes of our world and suddenly become targets. Sara backed toward her futon, her legs suddenly uncertain about their ability to keep her upright. She sat heavily. You're telling me werewolves are real? It sounded insane when she said it aloud. Absolutely, clinically insane. Yes, Don said simply. No elaboration, no long explanation or proof or attempt at convincing her of something that defied every rational principle she'd been taught. Just a single word delivered with the certainty of someone stating a fact so obvious it barely warranted acknowledgement. That's... Sara's hand moved to her chest, feeling her heart hammer beneath her ribs. That's impossible. And yet, here I am, Don gestured to himself, in your apartment, surrounded by my warriors, real as anything else in your world. He stepped closer and Sara had to fight every instinct screaming at her to run. The question isn't whether werewolves are real, Sara. The question is what we do now that you know. What do you mean, what do we do? Her voice came out higher than she'd intended. I won't tell anyone. I'll forget I ever heard anything. I'll delete your number and pretend this never happened, and we can all just... You're being hunted, Don interrupted quietly. His voice carried the weight of something final, something that couldn't be negotiated. Not by me, not by my pack, but by others who learned you possessed information you shouldn't have. The Blackstone Pack, the Eastern Collective, possibly the Crimson Circle. All interested in what you overheard, all willing to use any method necessary to extract that information from you. Sara's mind spiraled, grasping for logic in a conversation that had abandoned logic 3 turns ago. But I barely heard anything. I don't even know what they were actually saying. You know their intentions. You know their tactical approach. You know the specific boundaries they discussed. Don's eyes were steady on hers. That makes you either valuable or disposable, depending on their assessment of your usefulness. And I assure you, most packs lean toward elimination to remove the liability. The apartment suddenly felt very small, very cold, very much like a trap. But Don was right there, offering to be her jailer, her protector, her... what? Owner? Why are you telling me this? Sara whispered. If I'm such a liability, why not just... eliminate you? Don completed the thought, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. Because you're innocent. Because you stumbled into this world by accident. And because the moment I read your messages, something made me decide you were worth protecting instead. He moved toward her, and Sara's entire body went rigid. Fight or flight hormones flooded her system, but Don moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to process. He crouched in front of her, bringing his eyes level with hers, and the proximity was overwhelming. She could smell him, cedar and something metallic, something that made her primitive brain recognize danger, but also, confusingly, something that made her want to lean closer instead of away. You're trapped, Sara, he said softly. Not by me, not by my men waiting outside. You're trapped by knowledge you can never unknown, and by people who will now hunt you until they find you or until someone more powerful than they are protects you from them. You, she breathed. You're going to protect me. Yes. There was absolute certainty in that single word. You're under my protection now, your pack, by association if not by blood, and I don't allow threats to my people to continue breathing. The word people landed strangely, like she'd already crossed from human into something else, or at least into a category with a different set of rules. Different vulnerabilities, different protections. What happens if I refuse? Sara asked, hating the tremor in her voice. What if I don't want your protection? Don's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. something that might have been amusement or might have been predatory satisfaction. You don't have the option to refuse. You made that impossible the moment you texted me about pack business. You're involved now, Sara. The only choice you actually have is how you choose to survive what comes next. He stood, and Sara watched the power move through his body as he straightened, watching the controlled grace of someone used to being the most dangerous thing in any room. He extended a hand to her. Pack a bag. Clothes for a few days. Whatever matters to you. You're coming with me tonight. My compound is secure, my people are loyal, and no other pack will dare touch you under my roof. Sara stared at his hand. It was a normal hand, attached to a man who seemed entirely human despite everything he'd just told her. She could see the calluses on his palm, could imagine the strength in those fingers if he decided to use it. But he was offering it like an invitation, not a command. Except it was a command. They both knew it was a command. There was just a veneer of politeness covering the ultimatum underneath. And if I don't go with you? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Then I remove my protection and leave you to face 3 competing packs who want what's in your head. I'll give you 12 hours to pack before they converge on this location. He lowered his hand slightly, and his eyes locked with hers in a way that made her feel seen in a terrifying, intimate way. But you won't choose that option, will you, Sara? Because despite the fear, despite not knowing me, you understand that I'm the least terrible alternative available to you right now. He was right. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was trapped. Not by Don's presence, but by the existence of his world, by the knowledge of that world, by her own vulnerability in a game she didn't know how to play. She took his hand. The moment her palm met his, a current ran up her arm. Not painful, but present, undeniable that. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, though she could feel the power underneath that gentleness, the restraint. He helped her to her feet, and for a moment they stood there, her hand in his, closer than necessary. Pack quickly, Don said quietly. We leave in 20 minutes. He released her hand, and the loss of contact felt like falling. Sara stood there, staring at the empty space where his palm had been, realizing with absolute certainty that her life had just shifted into an entirely different trajectory. One wrong text. That's all it took to go from struggling graphic designer with unpaid invoices and a cramped apartment to whatever this was. A pack member by association. Protected. Owned, hunted, owned. Sara, Don said, and she looked up to find those predator eyes on her face again. You're going to be fine. I don't protect what isn't valuable to me. She didn't know if that was meant to be comforting, but the way he said it, like she was already precious to him, already important, already his, made her realize that whatever danger waited outside her apartment door, the most dangerous thing in her life was standing right in front of her. And she'd just agreed to go home with him. 20 minutes was not enough time to pack your entire life into a duffel bag. It wasn't even enough time to decide what mattered. Sara moved through her apartment like someone operating underwater. Her movements slow and dreamlike, despite the urgency Don's ultimatum had created. A sweater? Jeans. The medication she took for anxiety, which seemed almost laughable now, given that her entire reality was destabilizing in real time. Her phone charger, her laptop, because it contained her design portfolio and every shred of professional credibility she'd managed to build. Behind her, Don sat on her futon with the casual authority of someone comfortable in any environment. He wasn't watching her pack so much as simply existing in her space. His presence a constant reminder that she was no longer choosing her own path. A man with absolute power, patiently waiting for her to comply with his expectations. I need to call someone, Sara said, trying to sound reasonable. My landlord, my clients? No. Don's voice was soft, but carried the weight of an iron door slamming shut. But they'll wonder where I am. They'll think that you've gone on an unexpected trip. They'll figure it out. He watched her fold a shirt with shaking hands. You cannot tell anyone where you are or who you're with. You cannot contact your old life in any meaningful way. That phone becomes a liability the moment you use it to reach out. Sara's hand stilled on the fabric. You're going to isolate me. It wasn't a question. I'm going to keep you alive, Don corrected, his tone carrying the implication that these two things were synonymous. Isolation is a byproduct of survival, not a feature of your imprisonment. Imprisonment. There was that word again, floating between them like a ghost that no amount of reframing could fully exorcise. What exactly am I to you? Sara asked, turning to face him. The question came out angrier than she'd intended, which at least felt honest. Beneath the fear, beneath the attraction, beneath the crushing sense of helplessness, there was anger. Rage, really, at the unfairness of the situation. Because from where I'm standing, you've decided I belong to you based on one text message I sent to the wrong number. Don rose from the futon with fluid grace, moving toward her with deliberate slowness. He didn't crowd her space immediately. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Instead, he stopped just far enough away that she could see the intensity in those blue eyes without feeling physically threatened. Almost without feeling physically threatened. You have two choices, Sara, and neither of them involve staying here, he said quietly. Choice 1. Come with me. Stay under my protection. Remain part of my pack territory where the only way another pack could reach you is through an act of war against the Northern Dominion. Where my resources, my warriors, my power keep you breathing. He paused, and she watched him let that sink in. Choice 2. I walk out of your apartment. I remove my protection. I leave you here with that laptop you just packed and the hope that you can disappear before one of the other packs tracks your location, which they will do because they're very good at finding people who matter to their enemies. I leave you here alone. Sara's throat tightened. And what happens in choice 2? The Blackstone pack will arrive within hours. They'll want to know exactly what you overheard. They'll be thorough in their questioning. They may decide keeping you alive is unnecessary after they extract what they need. The Eastern Collective will want you as leverage against my pack. And the Crimson Circle? He paused, and his eyes darkened. They have no use for humans except as entertainment. The apartment suddenly felt like a coffin. Her apartment, which just hours ago had felt like a cramped prison of poverty and failure, now seemed like the last safe space on Earth. And Don was asking her to leave it. Asking wasn't even the right word. Demanding. Presenting an ultimatum wrapped in choices that were no choices at all. This is insane, Sara whispered. Yes, Don agreed. But it's the insanity that exists. The world you've stumbled into doesn't care whether you find it acceptable. Sara turned back to her packing, her movements more frantic now. She shoved clothing into the duffel without bothering to fold it, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and something that felt uncomfortably like capitulation. She was packing. She was preparing to leave. Which meant she'd already made her choice, even though she desperately wanted to pretend otherwise. How long? She asked, her voice tight. How long am I supposed to stay with you? Until it's safe for you to leave. Don's answer was perfectly reasonable and completely unsatisfying. That could be years. It could be. He didn't sound concerned about that possibility. Or it could be weeks if we managed to neutralize the threat properly. But I won't lie to you, Sara. You're valuable now. You know things about my competitors' movements. That makes you valuable to them and valuable to me. Either way, your old life is over. The finality of that statement hit her with physical force. Her old life. Gone. Not temporarily unavailable, not on pause, but genuinely finished. The cramped apartment, the unpaid invoices, the struggling freelancer existence, all of it erased by one careless text message. Why? Sara turned to face him, and her voice came out raw. Why are you keeping me? If I'm such a liability, why not just... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Don understood. Because the moment you texted me about pack business, something in me recognized something in you. His voice dropped lower, became more intimate. Not just as a security concern. Something else. He stepped toward her now, crossing the distance she'd unconsciously maintained. Sara's breath caught as he raised one hand, his fingers brushing against her jawline with a gentleness that seemed impossible coming from someone so powerful. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and the contact was electric. Part reassurance, part claim, entirely impossible to interpret as anything other than possession. I don't collect people, Don continued quietly. I don't protect those outside my pack without reason, but you, I need you more than just for information, Sara. I need you to come with me because the idea of you in danger, of you facing those packs alone, is something I cannot tolerate. Sara's mind spiraled. She wanted to pull away from his touch. She wanted to demand he stop manipulating her with proximity and power and the intoxicating reality of being wanted by someone so thoroughly dangerous. Instead, she found herself leaning into his hand, her eyes closing for just a moment. When she opened them again, Don was watching her with an intensity that made her feel like she was drowning. "I don't have a choice," she whispered. "No," he agreed, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone. "You don't, but you will. Eventually you'll have choices again, just not yet." He dropped his hand, and Sara felt the loss like a physical wound. She turned back to her packing, unable to meet his eyes, unable to navigate the confusion of fear and attraction and anger that churned inside her. 15 minutes, Don said, moving back to the futon. "We need to leave soon." Sara's hands moved automatically through the motions of preparation. She packed her toiletries, her jewelry, which consisted mostly of costume pieces from her college days, her journal, because somehow that felt important, like she might need to document what happened next or process it through writing. She packed everything she could fit into the duffel, trying not to think about what she was leaving behind. The apartment itself, the life she'd built, however humble and struggling, her independence, her autonomy, all of it, surrendered to a man she'd met 20 minutes ago who happened to be some kind of supernatural king. "I need to change," Sara said, looking down at her yoga pants and stained sweater. Don nodded toward her bedroom. "Quickly, and nothing that will draw attention. We're not trying to advertise your presence during the drive." The drive. To somewhere she didn't know. With someone she didn't know. Away from everything familiar. Sara changed into jeans and a dark sweater, telling herself it was practical and not a capitulation to his instructions. She met her own eyes in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked terrified and resigned in equal measure. Looked like someone who'd already accepted their fate. When she emerged from the bedroom, Don was standing at her window, looking down at the black SUVs waiting on the street. His warriors. His protection. His possessive force. Wrapped in security. "Are they always watching?" Sara asked. "Yes." He didn't turn from the window. "They'll continue to watch. It's safer that way. For you. Or it's imprisonment, and you're just reframing it." Don turned, and something flickered across his face. Not anger, exactly, but acknowledgement. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter when the outcome is the same. He was right. It didn't matter. Whether he was protecting her or imprisoning her, she was leaving her apartment. Whether she was choosing this or being forced into it, she was heading toward an unknown destination. The semantics were irrelevant when the reality was the same. Sara picked up her duffel bag. "I'm ready." Don's gaze swept over her, assessing. "You're not, but you will be. We have time for adaptation." He extended his hand again, that same hand that had touched her face, that had sent electricity through her nervous system and scrambled her ability to think clearly. This time, she took it without hesitation, too tired to pretend she had other options. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and Don pulled her gently toward the door. Sara allowed herself one final look at her apartment, at the life she was leaving behind, before stepping into the hallway. The moment she crossed the threshold, she heard Don speak into an earpiece, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We're coming down, full security perimeter, move out in 30 seconds. Her hand still in his, Sara descended the stairs toward the waiting vehicles. Toward her new life, toward a future she'd never chosen but could no longer refuse. Behind them, her apartment door swung closed with a finality that sounded like a lock clicking shut. The black SUV smelled like leather and something else. Something distinctly male and animalistic that Sara's brain couldn't quite categorize. She sat in the back seat beside Don, who occupied the space with the same effortless dominance he brought to every room. The driver ahead of them never spoke, never glanced in the rearview mirror. The third vehicle followed behind, a perfect triangle of protection wrapping around Sara like a vice. Don watched the city slip past the tinted windows, his profile sharp and contemplative. Sara wanted to ask where they were going, what to expect, what happened to people who stumbled into this world. Instead, she watched the familiar streets of her city transform into unfamiliar territory. They were driving away from the downtown core, away from the coffee shops and apartment buildings and the carefully constructed life she'd abandoned. "Don't look back," Don said quietly, without turning his head. "You won't recognize yourself anyway." It took Sara a moment to understand what he meant. That the person she'd been, the struggling graphic designer, the freelancer fighting for clients, the woman who'd been terrified of missing rent, didn't exist anymore. That version of Sara had been erased the moment she'd texted the wrong number. Looking back would only reveal how thoroughly she'd been transformed into something else. They'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when the third SUV suddenly accelerated, cutting ahead of them with aggressive speed. Don's body went rigid, his hand moving to Sara's knee in an instinctive gesture that might have been reassuring if it didn't feel like restraint. "Blackstone," the driver said, his voice tight. "2 vehicles, coming fast." The SUV lurched as the driver increased their speed. Sara's stomach dropped, her hands scrambling for something to hold on to. Through the tinted windows, she caught glimpses of pursuit. Red taillights growing closer, the unmistakable aggression of a chase. "Get her to the compound," Don commanded, and before Sara could process what was happening, he was moving toward the door, pulling it open mid-acceleration. "Don, what are you—" Sara reached for him, but he was already gone, rolling out of the vehicle with a grace that defied physics. The SUV continued forward without him, and Sara twisted in her seat to watch through the rear window. Don stood in the middle of the road, alone, watching the Blackstone vehicles approach with the serene confidence of someone who understood exactly how much power he possessed. The lead pursuit vehicle swerved toward him, clearly intending to run him down. At the last possible second, Don moved, not with human speed, but with something faster, something impossible. His body seemed to shimmer, and for a fraction of a second, Sara glimpsed something else beneath his skin. Something larger, broader. Teeth that had no business existing in a human mouth. The pursuing vehicle crashed into a parked car, its driver unable to compensate for the sudden presence of something that shouldn't exist in the middle of the road. The second vehicle skidded to a halt, and Sara saw figures in dark clothing pour out, weapons visible. But then Don was moving again. That impossible speed, that inhuman grace, and the warriors from the Blackstone pack were scattering like prey before a predator. Then the SUV rounded a corner, and Sara lost sight of him completely. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might break through skin. Her fingers dug into the leather seat, her breathing coming in shallow gasps. What had she just seen? What was Don? What had he become? "First time seeing an alpha shift?" the driver asked, his tone conversational. Like discussing the weather and not the fact that the man Sara had surrendered to had just transformed into something that belonged in nightmares. Sara couldn't formulate words. Her mind had fractured into pieces that refused to reassemble into coherent thought. "Don't worry, if he's anything, he's efficient. He'll catch up." The driver took a turn at aggressive speed. "Those Blackstone bastards won't know what hit them." The drive continued in tense silence. Sara perched on the edge of the seat like she might need to jump out at any moment. They drove for another 20 minutes, the city gradually giving way to less developed areas. Trees became denser. Roads became less traveled. The world transformed from urban to something wilder. When they finally pulled onto a long private drive flanked by wrought iron gates, Sara's breath caught. The compound spread across a vast estate. Not a house, but a complex of buildings arranged in what looked like deliberate hierarchy. A main structure that could only be described as a mansion, surrounded by smaller buildings she assumed housed warriors and pack members. The SUV pulled to a stop in front of the main entrance, and before the driver could move, Don appeared at the passenger window. He moved with perfect human grace, showing no sign of exertion despite having just engaged in what could only be described as supernatural combat. His suit was immaculate. His hair was perfectly in place. The only indication that anything had happened was the faint satisfaction in his eyes. "My domain," Don said as he opened Sarah's door. He extended his hand. "Welcome to the Northern Dominion compound." Sarah stared at his offered hand, the same hand that had shifted into something else, that had wielded power she still couldn't quite process. She took it anyway, because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting. Don's grip was warm and entirely, impossibly human. He led her through the main entrance into a space that could have belonged to a luxury hotel or an upscale restaurant, all soaring ceilings and carefully curated aesthetic. Warriors moved through the halls with purpose, their gazes sliding over Sarah with varying degrees of curiosity and assessment. "The Alpha returns with company," one of them murmured to another as they passed. Don's hand tightened on hers, a silent warning to stay close, to stay connected, to understand that she belonged to him in the presence of these others. They ascended a grand staircase into the upper levels, where the aesthetic shifted from public-facing luxury to something more intimate. Fewer people, more privacy, more control. Don opened a door at the end of a hallway, revealing a suite that was undeniably beautiful, a bedroom with furnishings that probably cost more than Sarah's entire previous apartment, an attached bathroom that looked like a spa, and a sitting area with windows overlooking the compound grounds. "This is yours," Don said. "You'll be comfortable here." Comfortable. Like that word meant anything in a situation where she was clearly being held in a gilded cage by a man who just transformed into a monster to protect her. "For how long?" Sarah asked. Before Don could answer, a sharp knock interrupted them. A man entered without waiting for permission. Older, with gray threading through dark hair, carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to power. His gaze assessed Sarah with an intensity that made her feel examined and found wanting. "Is it human?" the man asked Don, and the disrespect in his tone was unmistakable. "This is Sara Robertson," Don corrected, and something dangerous flickered across his face. "She's under my personal protection. As such, she's to be treated with the respect you'd show any member of this pack." "An outsider brought into the heart of our territory because of what? A security breach she created?" The man stepped closer to Sarah, and she instinctively moved toward Don. "She's a liability, Don. The council will want her questioned extensively." "The council will do nothing." Don's voice had dropped to something low and lethal. "Sarah is not the property of the Northern Dominion Pack. She is my responsibility. My protection. Should the council have a problem with that, they can bring their concerns directly to me." The challenge hung in the air between them, unspoken but absolutely clear. The other man held Don's gaze for a long moment before stepping back, inclining his head in a gesture that looked like reluctant acceptance. "As you say, Alpha," he conceded, then turned toward Sarah. "Welcome to the compound, Ms. Robertson." He left without another word, but his presence lingered like a warning. "That was Mikhail," Don said quietly. "My second in command. He's protective of the pack, which is why he questions my decisions." "Don't let his hostility disturb you." Don't let his hostility disturb her. As if she could simply regulate her fear response based on his assurance. As if she wasn't being held in a supernatural compound surrounded by creatures she didn't understand by a man whose true nature she'd only glimpsed for a fraction of a second. "I need you to understand something," Don continued, taking her hand again. "That form you saw, that's who I am beneath the human skin. An alpha is part man, part something older. Something that exists to protect his pack, to lead them, to destroy threats. When I saw you in danger, that part of me responded." "It was terrifying," Sarah whispered. "I know." He brought her hand to his chest, placing it over his heart, which beat with steady, reassuring rhythm. "But you're safe now. I won't let anything hurt you. Not the Blackstone Pack, not Mikhail's suspicions, not your own fear." His certainty should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified her further. This absolute conviction that he could protect her, that she was his to protect, that her fate was now irrevocably bound to his. Dawn released her hand and moved toward the door. "Rest. We'll talk more tomorrow. There's food in the kitchen downstairs if you're hungry, and anything you need can be provided. Just ask one of the staff." "Wait," Sarah said, a hot back. Where will you be? Managing the aftermath of our encounter with the Blackstone Pack, ensuring they understand the cost of challenging my boundaries. He paused in the doorway, but I'm close if you need me. Then he was gone, and Sara was alone in the beautiful, imprisoned room. She moved to the window and looked out at the compound grounds, the warriors moving through shadows, the perimeter walls, the infrastructure of an entire world that existed in the margins of human civilization. She caught her reflection in the glass, a woman she barely recognized, pale, frightened, belonging to a man who could transform into something inhuman and the world that came with him. There was no going back from this. Sara closed the curtains and sat on the edge of the bed, understanding with absolute clarity that her old life wasn't just over. It had been erased, replaced by something she couldn't control and couldn't escape. And somewhere in the compound, Don was moving through his domain with the absolute authority of an alpha king, undoubtedly thinking about her, planning for her, making decisions about what happened next. She was his now, not by choice, not by contract, but by the irrefutable logic of a world where the strong protected what they claimed, and she'd been claimed the moment she'd texted the wrong number. Morning came without mercy. Sara woke to sunlight streaming through windows she didn't remember opening, her body confused about time zones and timelines and the fact that she'd fallen asleep in a stranger's domain. The reality of her situation crashed over her immediately. No gradual awareness, just the sudden, brutal understanding that her old apartment and her old life were approximately 3 hours away and completely inaccessible. She forced herself to shower, to dress in clothes from her duffel that suddenly felt foreign against her skin. The bathroom mirror showed her reflection. Same face, same features, but worn and uncertain in a way that felt new. This wasn't the woman who'd woken up yesterday frustrated about unpaid invoices. This was someone else. Someone displaced. The compound was already buzzing with activity when she descended the main staircase. Warriors moved through hallways with purpose. Staff arranged themselves around the space with practiced efficiency. And everywhere, conversation stopped when Sara passed, all eyes tracking her movements like she was an anomaly that required monitoring. Ms. Robertson? A woman approached, tall, professional, her demeanor suggesting administrative authority. The Alpha has requested your presence in the conference room. Can I show you the way? It wasn't phrased as a question. The conference room was all sleek technology and tactical maps. Don sat at the head of a long table surrounded by his senior warriors, reviewing information on a display screen that showed movements Sara didn't understand. The moment she entered, his entire body seemed to shift. Nothing visible, but something fundamental in his posture, his attention, his presence reoriented entirely toward her. Sara, he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth, possessive, claiming. Thank you for joining us. The other warriors offered her nods of acknowledgement, but their expressions remained carefully neutral. She was being assessed and found to require constant evaluation. We're discussing the information you overheard at Westside Coffee, Don continued, gesturing for her to sit beside him. The intimacy of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I need you to walk through the conversation in detail. Every word you remember, every phrase, every inflection. Sara sat, hyper-aware of Don's proximity, of the way his shoulder nearly touched hers. She recounted what she remembered. Fragments of conversation, pieces she'd only half paid attention to while waiting for her macchiato. The more she spoke, the more the gathered warriors seemed to shift, to recognize the significance of what she'd heard. They mentioned the Westbrook area specifically, Sara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Said something about it being already claimed, and that expansion there would cause territorial conflict with the Northern Dominion. Don's expression darkened. He exchanged a look with Mikhail that carried heavy implications. That's the third expansion attempt in 3 months, Mikhail said. They're testing your boundaries, Alpha, checking for weakness. They won't find any, Don replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone used to being obeyed by reality itself. But this information is valuable. Sara heard their tactical assessment. They believe the Westbrook area is underdefended. They're wrong, but they believe it, and that's what matters for their planning. He turned to face her directly, And his focus was so complete, so total, that Sara felt like the room had disappeared. Like they were the only two people existing in the space. "You've given us critical intelligence," Don said quietly. "Information that could prevent a war, that possibly saves lives. You understand that?" Sara nodded, understanding also in that moment that Don wasn't just a man with power. He was strategic, intelligent, ruthless in his calculation, but not cruel about it. He was protecting his pack, his territory, his people, and by extension, protecting her by association. "Dismissed," Don commanded, and the warriors began gathering their materials. Before they left the room, he added, "Mikhail, prepare our warriors for enhanced patrols in the Westbrook sector. Increase visibility. Make sure the Blackstone Pack understands that territory is actively defended." Mikhail nodded and left without question, but not before his gaze lingered on Sara with something that might have been respected or might have been reassessed. It was impossible to tell with the pack hierarchy. When they were alone, Don turned to face her fully. And Sara realized with shocking clarity that this was what he looked like in his element. Surrounded by power, making decisions that affected entire territories, commanding absolute loyalty through a combination of strength and intelligence that transcended anything she'd previously understood as leadership. "You're terrified," Don observed, stepping closer. "Yes," Sara admitted, because lying seemed pointless. "But not just of you." "Of what then?" "Of understanding that you're genuinely protecting me. Of realizing that everything you've done, the ultimatum, the forced removal, the claim of ownership, was never about control. It was about keeping me alive." She met his eyes. "That's somehow more frightening than if you were just using me." Don reached out, his hand cupping her face with the same devastating gentleness he'd shown in her apartment. "You're right. I am protecting you, not because I'm obligated to, not because you're a pack member, but because the moment I read your message, something in me recognized something in you that I couldn't ignore." "That's not possible," Sara whispered. "You don't know me." "I know what I felt," Don replied. His thumb traced her cheekbone. "When you texted about the Alpha's territory, about pack business, something resonated, like you were reaching for me across the divide between our worlds, like you needed to be found." Sara's breath caught. This was dangerous territory, romantic ideation about kidnapping, about control disguised as protection, about the seduction of surrender. And yet, standing here with his hand on her face, she couldn't seem to summon the necessary outrage. "There's a concept in our world," Don continued, "of fated mates. The idea that some bonds transcend chance, that some people are designed by the universe to find each other, regardless of circumstances." "That's a fairy tale," Sara said, but her voice wavered. "Perhaps. But I felt your presence in that text, and I knew immediately that you mattered, that you would matter, that the universe wasn't making a mistake sending you to me. It was fulfilling something essential." His eyes searched hers. "You've seen what I am, who I am, and you're still here." "I don't have a choice," Sara whispered. "You do." Don's hand dropped, and he stepped back slightly, giving her space. "You could run. You could try to escape the compound, my protection, all of this. I wouldn't stop you. I'd bring you back, but I wouldn't stop you from trying." It was a lie, a gentle lie, but a lie nonetheless. They both knew she couldn't escape. They both knew the dangers that waited outside his protection. But the gesture of offering her the illusion of choice was somehow more intimate than anything he'd done before. "What happens to me now?" Sara asked. Don moved to the window overlooking the compound grounds. Warriors trained in the courtyard below, and he watched them with the focus of someone used to shepherding the lives and deaths of others. "That's uncertain," he said finally. "You could stay, become part of the pack in truth, not just association. Learn our world, our ways. Let what exists between us develop without the pressure of survival forcing it. Or you could eventually choose to leave, to return to the human world, to your old life, to pretend this never happened." He turned back to face her. "I would facilitate that if you asked, though I wouldn't be happy about it. The bond doesn't work that way for me. Once you matter, you always matter. but I won't hold you captive beyond what's necessary for your safety." "How long would that be?" Sara asked. "That depends on how long the threat persists. How long the Blackstone Pact continues their expansion attempts. How long it takes before they understand that encroaching on my territory has consequences." He paused. "It could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years." Years. The word hung between them like a prophecy. Don crossed the room and extended his hand to her, mirroring the gesture from the night he'd appeared at her apartment door. But this time, it wasn't a command. It was an invitation. "Come with me, I want to show you something." Sara took his hand, and Don led her through the compound to a tower overlooking the grounds. They climbed stairs in silence, and at the top, an entire world opened before them. The packed territory spread across thousands of acres, forests, meadows, streams. Warriors patrolled the perimeter. Training yards hosted young pack members learning combat. Homes of various sizes dotted the landscape, each representing a family unit within Don's dominion. "This is what I am," Don said, gesturing across the vista. "Not just a man. An alpha responsible for the safety and well-being of hundreds of people, for territory that must be defended. For decisions that determine whether people live or die." Sara watched him look out at his domain with an expression that was part pride, part burden. "And now you're asking me to become part of that," she said quietly. "I'm offering you the choice to become part of it," Don corrected. "Not demanding it, not forcing it, but making clear that if you choose to stay, you would be choosing not just me, but this. All of it." He turned to face her, and in the afternoon light, his eyes were impossibly blue. "I need you more than just for information, Sara. I need you because something in my nature recognized something in yours. Because you're the only person I've encountered who makes me want to be more than just an alpha king, more than just a leader of warriors and defender of territory." "I don't even know you," Sara said, but her hand remained in his. "You know enough," Don replied. "You know I'll protect you. You know I'll claim you. You know I won't let you face this world alone. And you know that what exists between us is something neither of us chose, but both of us feel." He stepped closer, and the space between them became charged with something Sara couldn't quite name. Something that felt like inevitability. "Kiss me," Don whispered. "Or tell me to leave. But decide, Sara. Choose what happens next." Sara's mind spiraled through arguments and counter-arguments, through reasons this was reckless and reasons nothing else mattered. She thought about her apartment and her unpaid invoices and the woman she'd been before one wrong text changed everything. Then she closed the distance between herself and Don and kissed him with the desperation of someone surrendering to something she couldn't fight. His hands moved to her back, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something primal and claiming. When they finally broke apart, Sara's breathing was ragged and her thoughts were scattered beyond recovery. "That's your answer?" Don asked, his voice low and satisfied. "That's my surrender," Sara corrected. She pulled back slightly, looking out at the packed territory spread beneath them. "I'm choosing to stay. Not because I don't have a choice, but because you're right. Something in me recognized something in you the moment you appeared at my door." Don smiled, and it transformed his entire face, genuine and unguarded and devastatingly beautiful. "Then welcome home, Sara," he said, pulling her close once more. "To the Northern Dominion, to my world, to me." Sara looked out at the sprawling territory, at the warriors and families and the life that existed in the margins of the human world. At the man holding her, who was neither fully human nor fully creature, but something caught between that was strong enough to protect her, ruthless enough to claim her, and broken enough to need her. She'd come to the compound as a prisoner. She was leaving this tower as something else entirely. As she turned back to Don and kissed him again, Sara realized that her old life wasn't over. It was just transformed into something she couldn't have imagined yesterday. And somehow, inexplicably, she was choosing to accept it. Subscribe for daily werewolf romance stories with strong heroines, fated mates, and epic plot twists. Comment your favorite part of Sara and Don's story and don't forget to grab your bonus in the pinned comment.